to this lecture and of this module on mobility and urban change of the PhD Urban Studies of the University of Milano-Bicocca Department of Sociology and Social Research. And let me introduce Professor Mimi Scheller. I'm very, very glad to introduce Professor Mimi Scheller, and who I thanks a lot for accepting our invitation. And just a brief introduction of Mimi Scheller. Mimi Scheller is professor of sociology and founding director of the Center for Mobility Research and Policy at Drexel University in the US. And she's the past president of the International Association for the History of Transport, Traffic and Mobility, and the co-editor of the journal Mobilities, which she co-founded in 2006 with Professor John Harry, and associate editor of Transfers in this Interdisciplinary Journal of Mobility Studies. And she graduated at Harvard University and at the New School for Social Research, and founded by eminent scholars like John Dewey, Thorstein Veblen. And she has been visiting fellowships in various international research institutions and the Center for Mobilities Research at Lancaster University from 2005 and 2012. And that she founded with the Professor John Harry in 2003. Then the Davis Center for Historical Studies, Princeton University, and several others, both in Europe and in the US. Her current work ranges from topics like low carbon sustainable mobility transitions, the Green New Deal, but also to broader issues in mobility justice and also topics such as global movements for food justice and sustainable tourism in the face of climate change. Among her publications, I'd like to mention the last two books. The first one is entitled Mobility Justice, the Politics of Movement in the Age of Extremes, in 2018, where she discusses the links between climate crisis and the challenges given by the urbanization phenomenon, and how mobility analysis can help us in understanding the overall picture, and also the issues arising in terms of justice and accessibility. And the last one, published a few days ago, focused on the topic of today's meeting, entitled Advanced Introduction to Mobilities, where Mimi Scheller offers a comprehensive analysis of the complex mobility disruption of the COVID-19 pandemic and its consequences. Thank you again, Mimi Scheller, for accepting our invitation, please, and to you. Thank you again.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here joining you, Professor Coglione, and thank you, Simone Caiello and the other members of the program, Urbeur-Urban Studies PhD program. It's such a pleasure to be with you. As I said, I wish it could be in person, but at least we can meet this way. And, you know, it's been 1 year now since the World Health Organization officially declared the pandemic. And so it means it's also been 1 year since I've been back to work at my university campus. We've all been working from home. And this year of challenges has been, I know, difficult for many people, and is what kind of led to the kind of writing that I've been doing recently and the topic that I'm going to speak about today, because I think that coming out of this field of mobility studies, we were already in many ways thinking about many of the kinds of concerns and issues that the pandemic has sort of intensified and thrown up at all of us to deal with. So that my remarks today are going to be related to a special issue of the journal Mobilities that just came out this week. I think it's in print, and it's called Pandemic Immobilities, Mobilities, Immobilities. So that's the starting point. And I think I will try to share my screen now so that I can show my slides. Are you able to see the slides?
Yes, perfect.
Great. So my talk is called Pandemic Immobilities, Mobility Disruptions, and Low Carbon Transitions. And I'm going to try to sort of talk about the aspects of the pandemic disruption that we also might want to think about as we move forward towards also thinking about low carbon transitions and climate change, and also why these two things are related to each other. As I said, the special issue is co-edited by my other co-editors of the Mobilities Journal, Peter Adey, Kevin Hannum, and David Tyfield. So as the coronavirus swept around the world in 2020, outpacing public health efforts to contain it, many of our everyday human mobilities were brought to an abrupt halt, while others had to be drastically reorganized. Viral mobilities have unleashed not just a disruption of mobilities, but also a vast intensification of already existing uneven relations of mobility and immobility. And we use the word immobilities with that parentheses just as a constant reminder that mobilities and immobilities are always connected to each other. There's a systemic relation between movement and non-movement and different kinds of immobility that are kind of entangled in mobilities. So it's a way to sort of think the two together. So critical mobility studies reminds us that as millions of people have been thrown out of work, suddenly now we're all aware of the fundamental premise on which our societies are built, that is constant but unequal movement. So the pandemic has reminded us of who still has to move, who still has to work, who cannot work, who has a home to stay in, who has nowhere safe to stay. There's constant unequal mobility and also placement, and it's that relation between them that the pandemic has sort of reorganized and disrupted and also brought out the sort of deep inequalities within that. Critical mobility studies range from the microscopic scale of viral mobilities and microbes that hitch a ride on human movement. And then it runs through, of course, the interpersonal and the urban scale of our everyday mobilities, and all the way up to studying what we call the macro scale planetary mobilities of the Anthropocene. That is how our energy circulates, how climate change circulates, what are the earth processes themselves that are in motion as we ourselves are in motion. So in this special issue on pandemic immobilities, we invited leading contributors in the field of mobility studies to address the multiple issues generated by the pandemic's relation to complex mobility and immobility at many scales, as well as to consider the deeper theoretical issues that arise when we consider the pandemic from a critical mobility studies approach. So we have a range of contributors, including Tim Cresswell, Ole B. Jensen, Sven Kesselring, and Milena Freudenthal-Petersen, and Noel Salazar, many others. I'm sorry, I didn't do a slide with the list of all our contributors, but it's an excellent issue, and I recommend you to read it. In the face of the pandemic, normal social practices are disrupted, and new material assemblages and temporal patterns emerge. Many people stopped going to work, unless they were deemed essential workers. Parents had to juggle working from home, those who had jobs that could be done from home. Children were kept home from school and struggling to learn online. And the sort of intense reorganization of domestic spaces is one important aspect of the pandemic. Of course, many businesses closed their doors while others had to reorganize their work processes. Airplanes stopped flying, airports emptied out, cruise ships were turned away from ports as borders closed, factories stopped churning out inessential products, and then the global shipment of goods first slowed to a trickle and now has come to a sort of logjam as there's been a resurgence and a problematic kind of restarting of the movement of container ships. And I begin with this slide partly as a reminder of the household and the domestic realm, which I'm actually not going to focus on today, but I think it's important to note that there have been very uneven effects on gender relationships, men and women, who's employed, who's not employed, who's doing domestic reproductive work and who is not. There's also been, in the introduction to the issue, we talk about the rise of domestic violence, actually, and a lot of issues around anxieties, stress, and violence that are happening within the domestic realm, which I won't speak to today, but they are addressed in the issue. As each affected region in turn has imposed social distancing measures and lockdowns on travel, some people, those who are privileged enough to have safe, secure homes, find themselves confined to their homes in which they must reassemble the means of work, of health, of reproduction, and survival itself. The standardized regularity of clock time has been interrupted by this real-time sudden impact of viral transmission, sudden illness, and for many people, the cruel endpoint of a rather lonely death. And, you know, in the United States in particular, we obviously have had some of the worst outcomes in the world. We are now past 520,000 deaths during the pandemic. And I know, of course, in Italy, you were very hard hit at the beginning. But for many people, the disruptions of life, the economic consequences, and the health risks that had to be taken were far more severe, whether through the necessity of continued mobility and social interaction as essential workers, or through immobility and lockdown under crowded conditions, calling into question the viability of social reproduction altogether. When the government of India shut down cities during the pandemic, millions of people were forced to leave the cities to their villages. In some cases, there were buses provided, but many people had to walk home to their villages hundreds of miles away, and quite likely carrying the virus with them. And I kind of contrast this image you see a woman carrying a child to the previous image of a European family at home. In this great expulsion of people from their urban workplaces and from informal settlements, we might see a harbinger that is a sort of foretelling of what might come in the future with climate change, as mega cities that have been attractors of vast population have to sort of expel those populations back out into the world. Megacities have been systems for managing population mobilities with these huge numbers of migrant workers moving in and out of them. And the pandemic has really kind of thrown that into question in ways that climate change also will continue to do in the future and already has been doing. On the heels of the global mobility disruption, there was also a shift towards many new patterns and kinds of mobilities. So for those who still had to work in essential jobs, there was the question of getting to work and how they would get there safely. There were the streets that had reduced car traffic, but were then opened up for biking and walking. There were the evacuations and repatriations of travelers returning from abroad, or trying to, in many cases with some getting stranded overseas. There were also new logistical processes that had to be created to refill grocery store shelves, to increase delivery services to people's homes, and to rapidly expand online learning, telemedicine, and to find other ways to keep informal economies afloat in sprawling global cities. So at the heart of many of these transformations there are complex intersecting systems of what we call mobilities and moorings, from the everyday travel by households to the provisioning of urban supplies, to the transnational mobilities of ships, airplanes, people across borders, and the planetary mobilities of viruses and entire ecological systems. In an earlier special issue of the journal Transfers on the theme of mobilities in a dangerous world, I had written in 2017 that dangerous mobilities have a kind of performativity insofar as they cause other things to happen. Invasive species spread around the world, affecting entire ecosystems. Man-made risks reverberate into cascading catastrophes. Diseases spread across mobile vectors. End quote. That was what I was thinking about in 2017. And it's true that the whole question of mobility disruption and dangerous mobilities had been on the agenda of mobilities research for some time. For example, with special issues on of the journal Mobilities on the topic of disrupted mobilities and mobilities in a dangerous world, as I mentioned in Transfers. So I want to posit that critical mobilities research is crucial to understand the COVID-19 pandemic and the restructuring of socio-spatial relations and mobility regimes, and the shifting and contested meanings of risk, security, and freedom that will emerge after it. And I'll say a little bit about the kind of approaches I'm thinking of. Within mobilities research, we have been especially focused on ways in which differential mobility empowerments relating to who can travel, when, where, and how reflect structures and hierarchies of power. And that's a quote from the 2006 introduction to the first Journal of Mobilities. So written with Kevin Hannum and myself and John Urry. It was the article called Mobilities, Immobilities, Moorings. So right from the beginning, this question of differential mobility empowerments and structures and hierarchies of power in sort of governance of mobilities were at the forefront of why the field emerged in the first place. A mobilities perspective on complex heterogeneous systems of mobility and immobility focuses attention on their dynamics and dynamism, including how the prevailing structures and hierarchies of power are themselves active. That is, they are not only cemented in place, but they can change and possibly change rapidly and dramatically in some cases and places. Now, the question of uneven mobilities, I think, is illustrated in this statistical image of deaths from COVID in the United States, where you can see the disproportionate cases amongst minoritized peoples in the United States who are most likely to have died. So we see in cases and deaths per 100,000 people a very strong impact on Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders, American Indian, Alaska Natives, Hispanic and Latinx people, and Black African American people who have had the highest death rates as compared to white and Asian Americans. And from our point of view, that comes partly out of the systems of mobility inequality and differential mobilities, as well as questions of residential density and segregation and access to healthcare and various other what some people call social determinants of health, but are also political determinants of health. So this relates to this the work I've done on mobility justice. That's the cover of my 2018 book on the politics of movement in an age of extremes. And the idea is to say that our response to the pandemic and our recovery are deeply dependent on and entangled with problems of mobility justice. Mobility justice as a concept challenges the forms of power and inequality that are embedded in governance and control of all forms of movement. And by forms of movement, I also mean forms of displacement and forms of staying in place. control over mobility is a form of power that has deep historical roots in what I describe as colonial racial capitalism, drawing on long theoretical traditions, and my work in Caribbean studies, which is the other field I work in. And I should mention that we didn't mention my other new book, which came out in November of 2020, which is called Island Futures, Caribbean Survival in the Anthropocene. And that's published by Duke University Press and is also very germane to this topic. So pandemic recovery and sustainable mobility transitions, I want to argue, will only succeed if we can overcome the existing system of mobility inequities through more just mobilities. So in other words, the climate change and the sort of sustainable mobility and low carbon transition demands mobility justice if it's ever going to work. And so too does pandemic recovery and a more equitable kind of relationship to health and to security and being able to survive under the current conditions. So in the background of this work in interdisciplinary critical mobilities, there are many different contributors. Anthropologists of mobilities have joined the call to study different intersecting regimes of mobility in which some people's movements are normalized while others are criminalized, which is how Noel Salazar and Nina Glitz-Schiller described regimes of mobility in 2013. The field also, of course, extends to many geographers like Tim Cresswell, Pete Adey, Pete Merriman, and others who in particular have looked at constellations of mobilities and histories of mobility as well. I also include communication and media scholars such as Adriana de Souza e Silva, who has done important work on kind of mobile digital spaces and networked mobilities and what she calls hybrid place. And we've published a book together on that topic. And architects and design studies, in particular, Ole B. Jensen's work on staging mobilities and designing mobilities. So all of these works kind of bring together this relation between human and also non-human movement, mobilities and immobilities, including objects, places, cities, infrastructure, nature, and more. The intersection of mobile practices, spaces, and subjects has also come to be described through what Thomas Nail calls a mobile ontology, in which entities, subjects, spaces, and worlds all emerge out of complex interacting mobilities at multiple scales. So Nail proposes that we actually live in the kinocene, sort of taking the idea of the Anthropocene to say we're now in an era of mobilities and of kinopolitics, a politics of mobility. And he also argues that we're subject to a new climate capitalism and climate colonialism that calls for a movement-oriented political theory. So I just wanted to introduce some of those kind of theoretical tools for thinking about different mobilities. I'm not going to spend a lot of time going into them because I want to return to the subject of the pandemic and in particular health and disease mobilities, which have been a topic in mobilities research for quite a long time. In fact, in the very first publication that I did on the new mobilities paradigm, which was an edited special issue of Environment and Planning A that John Urry and I co-edited, there was an article written by John Law, who you might know, the STS actor network theory scholar, and it was about the disrupted mobilities involved in the control of foot and mouth disease amongst animals in the UK. So right from the beginning, we were looking at diseases, disrupted mobilities, animal mobilities. And then in the 2014 Routledge Handbook of Mobilities Research, there's a chapter on disease mobilities written by Roger Keel, who has also been thinking about that topic for quite some time. And the chapter was reflecting on SARS, tuberculosis, and HIV/AIDS in relation to global mobilities. And he wrote there that diseased bodies step out of the realm of the normal into a new normal of uncertainty, where the world they know is turned upside down. Here also lies the historical reality of the continued treatment of the diseased as, quote, foreign bodies, through an often racialized, phantasmagoric representation that treats the sick body of an individual as an intruding threat on the supposedly healthy national body. And there he was quoting work by Saracen. And I think that's important to think about how that's come into play. That is, the diseased body and the mobile body appear almost as one. And certainly COVID-19 has raised awareness of the dangerous proximities of mobile bodies that have amplified entrenched suspicions and racializations of mobile people, that is, mobile labor, asylum seekers, refugees, and various migrants. Of course, here we see US citizens rushing home to catch flights before airports closed down. And this was predominantly white and upper middle class travelers and tourists and business people who came back very quickly to the US a year ago and probably were carrying the virus home with them. And yet they were welcomed into the national body as citizens. But the disease of COVID has marked a re-education and new awareness of our bodies as potential highly mutable vessels for disease, highlighting a peculiar mobility of infectious agents, and here I'm quoting, which transform the bodies of humans and other animals into vectors in order to move through space and across time. As Stephanie Laveau has put it, we can think of mobile bodies as vehicles and viruses as passengers of sorts, as travel companions and companion species. So we travel with viruses, we travel with microbes of many kinds. They are part of our bodies. And yet, mobile bodies are so frequently marked by categories of exclusion and labels of diseased outsiders. President Trump here in the United States, former president, referred and still continues to refer to it as the China virus. But the Nepalese prime minister also calls it the Indian virus. And there's always an attempt at externalization, which seems to be a key property through which COVID-19 has been felt. And it has played a constitutive role in the reproduction of social stigmas. So in the US, the crisis of COVID allowed the Trump administration to rely on a public health justification to immediately expel and push back anyone showing up at the border, even though they were being sent being sent back into life-threatening circumstances. Okay. But the US is not alone in this, and the EU has also seen blockades of the rescue of migrants at sea in the Mediterranean, blocking of rescue ships, and according to an article in our special issue by Charles Heller, who works with the group Forensic Architects, they've tracked the people being pushed back on inflatable rafts towards Turkey and sort of abandoned at sea. Heller argues for deconfining borders, arguing that the pandemic makes it even more urgent that we allow migrants to move in safe and legal ways in order to protect the health of both migrants themselves and the communities in which they arrive. And so, for the US to just push people back over the border and leave them on that side obviously is not protecting them from COVID, and it's not going to protect us from COVID either. The right to movement is always a matter of life and death, but even more so when one group's mobilities are perceived as threatening the biosecurity of another group. Indeed, the assertions that migrants bring disease into a nation have been crucial to the history of immigration control. As Sandro Mezzadro and Maurice Stirl argue, during the pandemic, quote, migrants embody in the harshest way the contradictions and tensions surrounding the freedom of movement and its denial today. It is not surprising that in the current climate, they tend to become one of the first targets of the most restrictive measures. Restrictive border measures endanger the lives of vulnerable populations for whom movement is a means of survival. So state projects of mobility management via bordering have always been an exercise in racial boundary drawing, encouraging the migration of some groups, like the return of those US citizens who I showed, but also, the welcome of migrants under particular conditions of visas for entry and labor, while other groups are discouraged in a way that Heller says that the war on the virus has been used to justify and step up the war on migrants. And I recognize that these are controversial claims and that the whole debate around what he calls deconfining borders and others refer to as the no borders movement, very controversial. And part of what I'm interested in is how those controversies kind of are playing out at this moment. And here I want to turn to Cresswell's formulation of constellations of mobility and also the longer historical perspective to think about this. When put in wider geographical and historical perspective, there is much in the arrangements and practices of governing mobilities under COVID-19 today that evoke earlier times, even pre-modern times. And here I show images that are meant to represent what are called miasmas. I imagine you have the word in Italian, miasma, maybe. The kind of public health guidance, which today is suggesting, the ventilation of rooms and the exchange of air, and also communicated through a forensic attitude towards dangerous surfaces and high-touch areas. There's a kind of a resurgence of this almost microscopic attunement to aerosolized particles of saliva and breath. And it seems to be recovering this kind of prior imagination of mobile matter in the form of miasmas. Miasmas were believed to be airborne noxious fumes of decaying matter that carried disease. And they kind of informed and drove health practices from the Middle Ages onward in urban planning and urban public health. Techniques to govern miasmas are not all that far from the COVID-19 ones that we see today. The quarantine-like arresting of movement in lockdowns and self-isolations to environmental management resembling 19th century sanitary science. And I should say, in many places now in the US, we have this kind of excessive wiping of surfaces and cleaning of things, even though it's somewhat questioned whether that's really the main way in which COVID is transmitted, which we know is airborne. And yet the performance of that kind of almost ritualistic cleaning gives people a sort of a sense of security and sanitation. So maybe our daily lives are now subject to renewed influence of what Michel Foucault called the specialists of space, who were found in the sanitary sciences, in the cleaning, attention to micro-architectural details, these high-touch doorknobs and elevator buttons, the designs of routeways and signage for social distancing, sanitation stations, cleansing, channeling bodies, and of course, face coverings. So we have this kind of return of this ancient or early modern form of managing health under the sort of uncertainty, the sort of unknowability of where the virus is lurking. And I think this will, have long-term effects on urban design and urban mobility, urban movement, but the use of public spaces, the use of buildings in many different ways. Likewise, we have the subject of animal mobilities, which also became suspect. While it is not yet entirely clear whether climate change facilitated the jump of the SARS-CoV-2 coronavirus from wildlife to humans, certainly scientists have been predicting increased risks of pandemics crossing over from animal species such as bats to humans. And we see that pattern with SARS and Ebola, et cetera. And mobility studies has been paying attention for some time to this question of what Lorimer has called animal mobilities. The alleged zoonosis, or animal origin, behind COVID-19's emergence helps us to understand its production as a consequence of other interlinked Anthropocene mobilities. Some authors have called COVID-19 the disease of the Anthropocene because it is widely believed to be the product of this expansion of human activities, agricultural, urbanization, and extractive activities into wilderness areas. The material mobilities that are depleting natural habitats have forced animal species into smaller environments, enabling the virus to jump to humans by intensifying human contact, including in these kinds of animal wholesale markets with both live animals and butchered animals close together and crowds of people. So COVID-19 is perhaps the perfect expression of Anthropocene mobilities, as Baldwin et al. Have written about in a special issue of Mobilities, which kind of defines this concept of Anthropocene mobilities. And they arise from this lock-in of our societies and industries to high fossil-fueled, fast accelerated mobilities, that is automobility, aeromobility, as a means of disease-carrying materials spreading and animals, including humans, moving long distances. Equally relevant are roads and air networks as the material infrastructure necessary for industrial scale agricultural extraction practices, which have involved the opening of roads in hard to reach areas, encouraging contact between humans and wildlife, and facilitating hunting and bushmeat consumption, while also creating new borders and segmentations in natural animal habitats. So we see both, especially in the Amazon in South America and in parts of Africa, this kind of extensive road building and deforestation. And in this sense, the road is positioned as a key conduit in advancing an agricultural frontier and growing the number of what are called biological ecotones, that is, the transition zones between ecological habitats, which allow increased movement between them. But we argue that surely the real difference is not just the roads into such spaces, which has been a long-standing process of accelerating destruction and extractivism, but also now their connection into these whole global systems and networks of air mobility that enabled the infection to spread globally, as well as to some extent sea mobility, because also cruise ships and freight ships have been involved in ships' crews. But the massively greater level of mobility within China and between China and the rest of the world in 2019-2020, as compared to when the SARS virus occurred back in 2003, could be a major factor in the different spread of COVID-19 versus SARS. And as David Tyfield suggests, that rather than stigmatize the Chinese wet markets, as many Americans have done, we might instead put viral mobilities of COVID in the context of human aeromobilities and the broader patterns of consumption and travel and tourism that are driving global climate change, which of course is led by the upper 10% of wealthy consumers in the industrialized world. So let me move now to a slightly different topic and bring us more to this other questions around transportation, urban mobilities, and climate change. New disease threats are understood as one of the outcomes of a changing climate as pathogens move in new ways. And certainly for some, this has intensified a rejection of the burning of fossil fuel and the critique of our whole entire systems of movement and mobility. Critically, during the pandemic, we began to see the impacts of a global slowdown of mobility and in particular fossil fuel consumption, even leading to the collapsing price for oil. As transportation and production seized up and international travel shut down, the demand for fossil fuel plunged. That is, the demand for flights, the demand for car trips, all of that fell quite steeply. And for some policymakers, the dramatic emptying of city streets prefigured a world in which we have reduced the dominant system of automobility and fossil fuel dependence, suddenly opening up space for the expansion of walking and biking and maybe bus rapid transit routes, which many obviously had been advocating for and sort of beginning to build out. But across many cities and towns worldwide, the pandemic has given this opportunity to respond to the lack of car traffic by introducing these new bike lanes, the corona lanes as they're called, whether temporary at first or seemingly becoming permanent. And we see this especially in cities like Paris, where Mayor Anne Hidalgo was, already putting this into action, but in many cities across Europe, but also cities like Bogota, Colombia, Mexico City, and even some cities here in the US, there has been a sort of concerted effort to bring in this intense increase in the number of bike lanes and what are called open streets. Of course, this also raises other questions about the sort of seizing up of mobility. If airlines go bankrupt, if trucking is severely reduced, if consumers stop buying new cars, will this actually kickstart the transition away from fossil fuels? Or will there be a rebound effect as countries seek to recover and pull out of this mobility shock? Will they seek to return to the high mobility, high energy, high carbon economy of the past? How can we actually use this moment to begin the urgently needed shift to a low carbon economy premised on more resilient, regenerative, and circular forms of exchange? And it's really not clear yet that we're going to be able to use this for kickstarting sustainable mobility transition. In fact, already in the US, we see a lot of bounce back towards car use. And there are, in fact, many complexities and paradoxical outcomes. So while the lockdown reduced car-based air pollution around the world, subsequent reopenings of some people returning to mobility has meant that they're avoiding public transportation. And we've seen huge declines in the US in the use of public transport, which has been even more hard hit than car-based and automobile transport. And also we see communities conducting things like shown here, drive-in virus testing, drive-in food distribution, drive-in services of all kinds. Now we have drive-in vaccination. So they're using car parks and other partly vacated infrastructures of automobility to kind of bring in people in their cars. And so there's a reversal, in a way, of the shift towards more sustainable travel modes. And there has been an increase in used car sales as people avoid mass transportation. So we now see this revalorization of the car as a kind of mobile but isolated, safe cubicle through all these new drive-in services. In another kind of rebound effect, there was the phenomenon of what were called zombie ghost flights. That is, as air route regulations kicked in on COVID, the airlines had to fly empty planes in order to maintain slots at busy airport hubs. And we also see things like freight ships bringing goods from China to the US. Instead of loading up at our ports here, there's such a backlog and a slowdown to pick up, say, like agricultural products, that the ships are turning around and returning empty across the Pacific to China rather than waste the time waiting to fill up with goods. So there's all of these strange rebound effects and consequences, which seem to be the opposite of where, the planners and the urban transition advocates thought we might be going with this. While some people might see this as the wrong time to worry about climate change during a health emergency that needs immediate response and an economic depression that will linger for years, we also see the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement and the whole question of racism and white supremacist movements in the United States. These three things are connected. I want to argue that our societal response to COVID-19 might share crucial elements with our needed response to climate change and to racial justice. And our failures to contain COVID-19 in the US also might foreshadow the failures of governance of climate change, and set in motion the failure of governments and societies to even learn from these failures. Each of these climate change, the pandemic, and the movement for Black Lives Justice are all complex mobility problems that remind us that the world is interconnected and we cannot wall ourselves off. Above all, it is becoming clearer that the response to racial injustice, to the coronavirus, and to climate change share common elements. Proponents of the Green New Deal here in the United States, and perhaps of the Green Deal in Europe, are calling for a massive transformation of our energy infrastructure, housing, and transportation systems through public investment in renewable energy, energy efficiency, and low carbon transportation. And many do believe that the massive mobility disruption of the pandemic offers us the opportunity to really launch these plans through massive stimulus spending. As you probably know, the US has just passed a $1.9 trillion relief bill, and is now going to move forward quite likely towards a major infrastructure bill. And these proposals, it is argued, are exactly the kind of public financed stimulus that can not only pull us out of the deep economic recession, but also rapidly build communities with greater equity and social solidarity, all things that we need coming out of the pandemic. So while we're still in the middle of the immediate emergency response and just trying to get back to work and get back to school and so on, it's worthwhile to begin to envision a plan for a robust recovery and rebuilding process. Across much of the world, post-COVID recovery is being framed in terms of place-based, resilient, localized greening approaches. Ideas such as the 15-minute neighborhood. And this is happening even in countries that were not that committed to climate action in the past. Yet these Green New Deal plans have also met strong resistance and critique. And that's why I want to argue that critical mobilities theory is crucial at this moment of sort of planning and moving forward, because of the way we have been focusing on the problem of low carbon transitions, power and inequality in the governance of mobilities and immobilities, and understanding how everyday social practices are embedded in complex systemic change, not in individual choices or consumer buying patterns or something like that. We argue that resilient and sustainable communities will require new kinds of mobilities, including not only the systems for transporting goods or moving people, but also the narratives, the cultures of mobility and dwelling through which we organize and sustain everyday practices. Changing the ways that we do mobilities will be crucial to the post-COVID-19 world, and also the way that we imagine and speak about and narrate and give story to those potential future mobilities. And making sure that we do so in a socially equitable and just way will be crucial to the future of the world. Who moves and who doesn't? Who has to move and who does not? When do they move and where? And who gets to choose when and how? all of these questions of interlocking mobility and immobility are central political issues of the post-pandemic era, subject to ongoing, restless, vigorous, and reconstitutive contestation. I want to refer to one of the articles in the special issue by Milena Freudenthal-Peterson and Sven Kesselring, who draw our attention to what they call the mobile risk society and the ways in which the pandemic has forced us to renegotiate and redefine rules and norms of mobilities that were previously taken for granted. So in their work, they bring together Ulrich Beck's theory of risk society with John Urry's and mine and my colleagues' mobilities paradigm to ask how urban mobilities will come out of the fear and what they think of as the deceleration of pandemic confinement. And in particular, they argue that as global risk society has metamorphosed into what Kesselring calls mobile risk society, issues of security and liberty loom large in the public political imagination, with intriguing and unsettling consequences for settled political spectrum and power relations. So differential mobility and immobility are sort of coming through the pandemic, through these complex issues of the freedom to move or the compulsion to move, the freedom to stay put or the compulsion to not be able to dwell in a place. And COVID may presage an unfamiliar reorientation of politics and the governing of risk, including climate change. This seems to be characterized by turbulent and shifting coalitions clustering around quite polarized interpretations of specific risks as issues of freedom, the right to move, and security and threats to movement. So for example, here I show several publications and events related to bike justice movements in the United States. And these movements have been going on for some time and challenging the mainstream kind of urban planning system, which they see as white and exclusionary, and that they're challenging the racial exclusion and the gentrification processes that have been associated with a lot of the planning around bicycling and bike lanes and bike activism, and bringing into it much greater racial and ethnic calls for racial justice. And so that's one kind of like contestation of the politics of sustainable mobility. And at the same time, we see contestation coming, for example, from the right-wing movements in the United States who refuse to wear face masks because they say it takes away their freedom, their liberties, their right to be out in public and move around as they want to without wearing masks. So these very contradictory politics are taking place. And I just want to sort of bring this talk towards an end by talking about the afterlives of liberty and freedom. And here I'm especially drawing on some of the arguments that David Tyfield has been making in his work, but in part that COVID-19 has exposed profound and insoluble tensions between the maximization of liberty at both the individual level and the systemic level, and freedom of movement is in tension with security during the pandemic because we have to protect each other from the virus, and it compounds mobile risks. And in that sense, it presages an unfamiliar reorientation of the governing of risks, including climate change. And Tyfield argues that contending underlying value systems are not only pitching various interpretations of liberty against its supposed opposite of constraint, but also against itself, that is, against diverse forms of and claims to liberty, which are being pitched against each other. So for example, the right of the tourist to travel, or the right of the migrant to cross borders, the right to be on a street as a pedestrian, a biker, or a driver, these now are all in conflict with each other. And the pandemic may be forcing us to redefine core political values of liberty and freedom, and therefore come to new agreements upon limitations of movement, on sovereignty and the governance of mobility, and how we determine the freedom versus the compulsion to move. So the right to travel for no reason at all, just because you want to travel, emerges as a key issue of mobility justice. And so too does the right to remain in place and to not have to move. And these are exactly the political kind of questions which are at the core of climate change as well, and sustainability transitions. So we believe the pandemic is kind of pushing us to reconfigure and think in new ways, and new constellations emerging politically around these key issues of mobility justice. And I think I'm going to end there. And that's the cover to the new Advanced Introduction to Mobilities, which will be out from Edward Elgar Press, literally, I believe, in 1 week. And that's the reference for the special issue of Mobilities on Pandemic and Mobilities, which this talk is drawn from. And I really look forward to your questions and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, okay, thank you very much for your very, very interesting lecture. And so we have, Simone, 30 minutes or more?
No, more. Yeah, more than 30 minutes. Yeah.
More than 30 minutes in order to open the discussion with
time up to 6 o'clock, if you like.
More or less 100. Okay, so we have a very, very large audience, more or less 100 attendants. I'm very happy about it. So we can open the discussion.
Yes, of course, if anybody from the audience wants to ask any question, can write in the chat here on the side, and we will forward it to Professor Michelle in case. But I would like to start maybe from our PhD students, if they have any question about what we discussed today, thanks to Professor Michelle, and also linked to other interests they have connected to this lecture.
If no one, can I start with my question? Okay. Thank you very much. It was a super interesting lecture. And I have a question regarding the cycling infrastructure and the pop-up bike lanes and the rapid speed bus lanes. You mentioned that I've read in your book that you favor the participation of the cycling advocates, and you think it's very important that the group gets a louder voice. And what I was thinking during your lecture now, that are you so do you see it only as a chance, this pandemic, for increasing the share of cycling infrastructure in cities and the modal share of cycling, or is it also a kind of danger that it gets into the more gentrification kind of discussion? That, for example, I mean, in the pop-up bike lanes, I'm from Berlin, and they appeared in the richer neighborhoods, and where, for example, the government is sitting, and the apartments are much more expensive, and not in the suburbs or in the more deprived neighborhoods. And yeah, that would be my question.
Yeah, great question. And definitely the movements that I'm speaking about here in the US, which include the untokening movement, People for Mobility Justice, a group called Equiticity in Chicago, and other planners and advocates around racial and justice and mobility justice, they have been critical of some of the pop-up bike lane planning and infrastructure. And so I would say there's definitely a tension there, because initially the critique was around the fact that at the moment where essential workers, many of whom are Black and brown in the United States, that is African American and Latinx people, were having challenges just getting to work because public transit was reduced its hours and cut its services, and they couldn't even get to work safely. That was when these sort of bike advocacy, mainstream bike advocacy was talking about pop-up bike lanes and open streets and almost a kind of leisure-like use of the space for the people who were safely working at home to be able to come outdoors. And so like politically, it just rang really falsely for people interested in protecting the lives of the essential workers. Now, you could say there could be ways to do it. Like I mentioned bus rapid transit, which people are advocating for. And people do want redesign of streets to be safe and equitable and inclusive. And so ultimately, yes, you could have bus rapid transit with bike lanes, but it's kind of the question of who's doing, again, why the conversation is important, that it's inclusive and driven by those who have been most harmed by our existing infrastructure. The other aspect of that became very controversial in the US was the pop-up restaurants using sidewalks, which are sometimes called streeteries. And again, the streeteries were meant to be helping the restaurant businesses, but they also blocked the sidewalks, and especially for people using wheelchairs or even just pedestrians getting around, having these kind of gentrified restaurant people in like plastic domed bubbles with heaters was kind of galling for people who felt it wasn't inclusive of their needs. So there's just a lot of conflict and tensions around these issues. And that's why having the conversation not just be driven from top down, but to sort of get to these community-based organizations and movements is really important so that they can help influence what happens. I hope that answered your question.
Thank you very much.
Hello, good evening, if I may. I don't know if I take the floor. Yeah.
Yes.
Just for general knowledge, since we were talking about this, actually it came to my mind that in our city, Milan, that's where I come from, actually we also have this kind of biker movement. It actually their protest takes place every Thursday night. They're called the critical mass. And it's basically this mass of people biking around or skating around for the city and purposely not really using a cycling path, but I mean, of course, the aim is to take the streets. So being the bigger the mass, trying to be the biggest as possible. And they basically take the streets. Of course, here in Italy, it's not coupled with ethnical or minorities instances, not really, but I would not even say that it's ascribable to any specific political party or instance, but it's just, let's say, bottom up attempt of requests, and they basically occupy the streets. They're both bikers and skaters and so on, and actually this also links to what we said yesterday, because apparently, especially Milan, but the bikes seem to be something related to a question of class somehow, because eventually it's easier to be able to also to safely ride a bike in the city center, in the very, very city center, rather than in the suburbs. And about and unfortunately, I'm afraid that in Italy the method of public transport, I'm afraid, is facing almost the opposite trend, because at least in the previous weeks, the public transportation supply has been out, but the needs are still the same. So actually, we face the opposite problem of students crowding, the buses in the very early hours in the morning, still facing the problems. And the solution was just to halve the public transport and not truly, let's say, linking the supply with the demand of this service. And again, this pandemic is showing how the virus is supposed to be very democratic. Usually pandemics are supposed to be very democratic, but eventually this one seems not. And my question was actually about, it was very interesting that you found some minorities being more affected either in death and in being and in virus mobility. But my question was, if you were talking of islander and Hawaiians in Hawaii, or always in the territory of the United States? And my second question is about the role of these markets, especially in Wuhan. And if you could clarify more what was the crucial factor for this jump between animal and human, if it is more to blame, if we have to blame alive animal markets that are actually very important elements of the local culture, and I think we immediately enter in a very tricky topic, or if we can keep and focus on the loss of ecological, of natural and ecological space. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your question. So there was a lot in there, and I'll just say, well, just briefly on the statistics on virus exposure and deaths. Those include the each state in the U.S., of which, you know, Hawaii is a U.S. state, so the Hawaiian Pacific Islanders includes the population of Hawaii. Obviously, it's a smaller population. So when you look at cases per 100,000 people, that is kind of a statistical anomaly in some sense, but it also reflects how some population groups have been more affected than others. On the latter part of your question, I'm not a scientist of, you know, the exact, I couldn't answer the exact origin of the virus, and is it the wet markets or isn't it? I mean, obviously that's a topic of great debate and interest and research that is still being done, and I don't think anybody has confirmed it, as far as I know, one way or the other. So I couldn't venture to say, but I do think there is a strong body of research in general on this zoonosis, this animal origin of new viruses, right? So new viruses are crossing over into human populations from animal origins. And the mechanisms of that vary. So some link it to these markets or to bushmeat, but others link it to, you know, the pressures of just being in those areas with especially like factory farming. And in the Amazon, for example, you know, the expansion of farming into the Amazon has put large numbers of domestic farm animals, agricultural animals, in closer contact with wild areas that are known to hold virus populations, right? So that might also be linked. You know, we saw in Denmark, they had to eradicate the entire population of farmed mink, right? That were carrying, they were seen to be infected with the COVID-19 virus, and so they've killed their entire mink industry. And that's kind of reminiscent when we go back to that, I mentioned that UK case of foot and mouth disease back in 2005 or 6, where again, you know, the slaughter of farm animals occurs to control these viruses. There's earlier instances of that. I should mention in my work on Haiti, there is a very still bitter memory that the United States was fearful of a kind of swine disease that was found in certain places, and they ordered through I think through the UN, also the World Health Organization, or the FAO, I guess it would be, the slaughter of all of the pigs in the country of Haiti. So they're called Creole pigs. They were adapted to Haiti over many years, and they were all killed, and the people were not compensated fully for the loss of of those pigs. And that was back in the 1980s, and that was to control swine flu. So there's complicated questions around that. But I just want to come back to also what you were saying about critical mass. So the critical mass rides are different than the movements that I'm talking about, right? There's an earlier trajectory of the development of critical mass and the sort of claiming of the streets by bicycling groups. And those traditionally were not linked necessarily to racial and ethnic justice issues. But subsequently in the United States, there's been a different kind of twist to these bicycling movements, which are about racial justice and link in a way to the Black Lives Matter movement and in some cases to a critique of critical mass. Okay, so there's various histories of that, and there's interesting work on it by a number of scholars of cycling movements.
Thank you.
And I got a question if anybody else is
Io voglio lavorare.
maybe asking for making a question, and I would like to also in this way introduce some of the observation of the audience. So in order to enrich the discussion, I really appreciated a lot, Mimi, your talk, in particular for the fact that you were talking about the potential emergence or the rising of new values. I think that for sure, I don't know if it will happen, but for sure we understand better, thanks to this emergency, what are the values under which we all on which we all live. You mentioned also the apparently crazy and actually crazy mechanism of ships leaving ports without carrying other stuff just because they must do it, and but many other examples we could bring, of course. And I think that so the main at least one of the results of the situation is to highlight what are the criticalities of our current times, like also the climate crisis did before this main pandemic crisis. So I wanted to leave some spots, some insights that some of the audience, members of the audience brought in the discussion in order to understand also what are the contradictions between the impact of pandemic on different kind of population. For example, I hope to pronounce correctly the name, I'm sorry. Yesedia Cáceres says, in Peru during the pandemic, there were food vendors walking the streets, taking food to the most favored households that were able to stay at home. But this has generated an income opportunity for those who had no other option, which also reflects the opportunity for new food marketing channels. And on the other side, let's say, Lois Wilken says, a colleague of mine studied the carbon footprint of academic conferences some years ago and suggested adopting virtual conferences as the norm. Can you comment on this? So we see some different impacts of the situation. So I just give you a comment on that.
Sorry, was that last on online conferences, did he say?
Yeah, a colleague of mine, says Lois Wilken, studied the carbon footprint of academic conferences some years ago and suggested adopting virtual conferences as the norm. Yeah,
so actually I've just contributed a chapter to a book, a forthcoming book on academic aero-mobilities. And it's about precisely this question of, this last question of academic travel and conferences and their carbon footprint. And yes, they have we have a huge carbon footprint. And I, in particular, for the chapter I wrote, I decided to measure my academic travel carbon footprint over the last decade. So I took 10 years of my curriculum vitae and looked at every trip I had taken for academic travel. And then I did a carbon calculation and put it all on a chart and added it all up. And it's appalling because I was traveling quite a lot until this year. and often getting invited to these kinds of events when they were not virtual, they were live. So I think I had something like 34.5 metric ton equivalents of CO2 emission production over the last 10 years just from academic travel. So hopefully for academics, one thing that will come out of this is that we will continue virtual meetings. And certainly we've all learned how to do them, and we've learned the technology for doing them and the pros and cons and best practices and so on. I can still imagine a future in which there will be forms of what we might call slow travel, where we are given enough time to spend a longer visit somewhere, and so that the trip itself will be linked to a longer stay to build more connections. And, you know, of course, that's challenging depending on family circumstances, and also that younger academics who are still building their kind of network may still need to travel. So we should have basically, I think, a carbon cap on people like me. I should not be allowed to travel anymore. I should stay home and meet you all virtually. And younger academics should be able to travel and you know, get a carbon budget to spend, because they have not had the benefit of building those networks yet. That's one thing to think about on that front. And the other question, oh, I've forgotten what the first question was about.
Sorry, it was just an observation, and was like this. In Peru, during the pandemic, there were food vendors working in the street.
So the food vendors, yeah. So that's been a huge factor in many countries, which is partly what I'm talking about as the reorganization of mobilities, is that when we talk about the people who are able to stay home and work from home, who are often wealthier individuals or higher income individuals, those with employment, with online means to connect and keep working, they may be like less mobile physically, but they're exercising what in the mobilities field we call high mobility capital. That is, they have motility, which is they have the power to self-determine whether they can move or stay still. And part of being a high motility individual is that you can have other people bring things to you. So you have other people move to service your home and bring food and bring deliveries of, you know, here it's Amazon deliveries. So everybody who was able to and could afford it shifted to less physical mobility for themselves, but put more people in motion to bring goods to them. So the food vendors are one part of that, the delivery services, the bike delivery riders, the truck deliveries, all of that increased during the pandemic in a sense, and became very much, it's linked to an informal economy in some cases, a gig economy in other cases. These service platform companies like Amazon, of course, has made a huge profit on the pandemic because of the increase in these services. So what we see is that what appears to be lower mobility for those people staying still is not actually for the system as a whole. So instead, there's all these kind of micro deliveries coming to them all the time throughout the day. So that's partly why we want to look at this relationship between those mobilities and immobilities. And as you say, yes, it is an opportunity for the workers who are doing that. But are we protecting those workers? Are we taking care to have policies to make sure those workers are not harmed in doing that kind of labor, that mobile labor, especially during the pandemic?
Yes, I have a question. And yes, discussing the issue of transport justice, and you properly argued that this is too narrowly focused on transport alone. And whereas the special justice is too narrowly focused on the urban scale and is not very mobile. And putting forward the concept of mobility justice you suggested to adopt a capabilities approach in order to think about different capabilities for mobility. And this leads to many key questions, in my opinion, but I will limit myself to a more general one. In your opinion, how we can support building greater mobility justice? Thank you.
Okay, so that's a big question, and it's
Yes,
one I'm working on in work in progress. And in that work, you know, at the end of the book on mobility justice, I begin to talk about the concept of a mobile commons. And what does it mean to think about that? And many people are familiar with the concept of commoning and commons, in particular people influenced by the work of Silvia Federici, who is the Italian feminist theorist of commons and commoning, along with George Cafensis. And that work is really interesting to think about what would commoning mean, and a mobile commons, if we think of the commons not as a still a place or a shared resource, but we think of it as how we come together and move in the world. And not only how do humans move in the world, but how do animals and other beings move in the world. And if we were thinking of this kind of shared space of mobile commons, we would be, again, like that idea of balancing different liberties and freedoms against each other, and thinking about a shared space in which we move, in which we do not harm others. We make room for, we include other kinds of movers. And I think those ideas around commoning are going to be helpful for thinking about urban planning in the future. So what would urban planning look like if we changed our sense of the movements? We weren't just thinking about the space or the buildings or the parks or the plazas, but we were thinking about the sort of moves or combinations of flowing constellations, how they can share the urban space in a less harmful way. And that would suggest enabling all different kinds of capabilities for mobility. So from a capabilities perspective, for me, it's not just, okay, it's not just about accessibility. It's not just like, okay, can this person get to, you know, a healthcare service? Can they get to food? Can they get to shopping? But the act of moving itself as a capability that we support for all people. And in other words, if you think of a street, if you have cars barreling down a street at, you know, 60 kilometers per hour, nothing else can be on that street. If you limit their speed, you can possibly mix it with other types of movers. So it's, again, ideas of limits, of sharing, of commoning, the entire way that we think about the use of those spaces of mobility and infrastructures of mobility within cities, including also digital mobilities as a whole nother sort of side of that question also.
Thank you. Thank you, Mimi.
If there is time, I have a question.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. And very thank you for the presentation. It was very, very interesting. And thank you for sharing with us all the complexity of these issues. And during the lesson, I was thinking about the policies, and because you show us how mobility issues are intertwined, and so the politics of infrastructures with the wide variety of actors and also contradiction, and on the other hand, the politics and so what is my question is maybe more methodological, if we can say, and because of this complexity, you mentioned before the interdisciplinary issues, and so lots of disciplines that speaks about mobilities, and there is also a complex to make these disciplines speak together sometimes, and because all these has their own semantics, there are narratives, and so if you have any suggestion to how to deal with this for us as young scholars, and thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Oh, that's a challenging question because it's so important still, I think, for young scholars to have to sort of establish their skill set, their ability to work within a particular discipline or methodology, and that then makes it hard for them to jump straight into doing transdisciplinary work. And I think that's always been a bit of a challenge, but also, as you say, the complexity of mobility research approaches that are, as I sometimes say, multi-scalar, right? It then becomes a methodological challenge because how do you work across different scales? And so there are a number of books that have come out about mobilities research and different handbooks for mobilities research and mobile methodologies, mobile methods books, which I think like look at specific questions and cases in interesting ways to sort of ask about how to study that. But I feel like in the journal Mobilities, we try to publish like across a range of different types of methodological approaches. And if I were trying to like give an example of one that like cuts across different scales, some of the interesting work on migration and borders kind of looks at being mobile with migrants and doing things like following or critical mapping, counter mapping, and having migrants who sort of tell their story through a map and then cross a border or attempt to cross a border where they're then dealing with the national scale and the sort of transnational as they're moving. And that's been one way to sort of like embed both like the personal mobility of the individual bodily scale and what they face en route to maybe like the collective that they're with, and then to the national structures of bordering that they're kind of caught up in. So I think we often talk about like mobile methods as one way to try to move, not just move like across sites of research, but across scales of research, and to understand how the transnational operates at the sort of personal level as well, so that we talk about the scales being entangled. So the challenge is to design, how do you design a research study that sort of allows you to sort of do that? And it is like the idea of constellations of mobility is one way to try to capture that. Another example I sometimes give of constellations of mobility is when I was doing work in Haiti after the 2010 earthquake. I describe like the mobility happening on a street in Haiti. So there I am, I'm standing on the street, and other people are on the street, and we're moving, we're passing by in different ways. But I've come as a foreign traveler with a passport, and I arrive and I can rent a car with my colleagues, and we're in a big SUV, and we have air conditioning and we have tinted windows. We are rolling down the street in a particular constellation. We have cell phones with satellite access. At the same time, there are people on the street locally who are on foot or on carts or on bicycles, or they're on public transport, either in a truck called a tuk-tuk bus or a moto taxi. They're on the back of a motorcycle. It's dusty and it's hot and it's dangerous. And then there are UN vehicles, which are these peacekeepers, these big armored vehicles, and they're rolling along also. And so there's all these like rolling assemblages of different mobilities, and we face different risks, and we bring different mobility capabilities with us as we move through that shared space. And that's another way to like take a moment and think through what are the different constellations of mobility informing that particular site. And as Tim Cresswell's work shows, it's a combination of our movements, meanings, and then our embodied practices. And that's part of the interdisciplinary nature of it, is to look both at the physical, movement from A to B, and the embodied practice and experience, which is more like ethnographic and anthropological, and the meanings, which are very much kind of cultural tools to understand.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, Mimi, I got other questions always from the audience, so it's not, not just me.
Okay.
And are two that are almost, I think, linked, because they talk about also the role of mobility studies in this situation. And the first one is the following: critical mobility studies from Tiago Allis. Sorry. Critical mobility studies are greatly connected with the emergence of the so-called new mobilities paradigm, or the mobilities term, that took place in several academic for 15, 20 years ago. Do you feel that the pandemic will bring, or is bringing, a new wave of deep analysis and theorization of mobilities, or it is just momentaneous euphoria? And the other one that I think is quite linked is more focused on the topic of mobility as a common, as you also discuss in your book about mobility justice, and if the impacts of these new configurations of viral mobilities can give some inputs about the concept of mobility as a common.
Okay, so thank you for those questions. Tiago, nice to hear from you. And yeah, I mean, I think, the field, as you say, it's been developing 15 or 20 years, but I feel like this moment of the pandemic has brought an even greater need to think in these ways. I mean, we already felt a need to think in these ways, but I feel like even more so, we should be moving towards this kind of transdisciplinary and mobile social science perspectives, which also cross into the humanities, I should say, and history, as a way to understand this moment. And in some ways more limited, I feel like single disciplines, which are kind of siloed, are unable to address the complexity of it. And that was how we always felt, in a way, about climate change and the sort of idea of a sustainable mobility transition, or sustainability transition more broadly, was that we needed a more complex intersectional approach to all of these different factors: social, political, economic, cultural. And the same, I think, is true from the pandemic, that we also see a need for this. And I guess the challenge is how to train students in doing this, and how to build up, a sort of body of research and work that collaborates with public policy and with all designers and architects and plans and infrastructure and engineers. How do we sort of bring all of that together? And people, I think, are experimenting with various kinds of like futures workshops and different ways of working on scenarios that can sort of assemble different participants together to sort of think through what we're doing next. And so I feel like mobilities research is an important part of that. Now, how that happens in a particular location in Sao Paulo or wherever one might be, that is a question for I think the local participants to sort of figure out how to make that work. And on the question of what was our other question?
Mobility as a common.
Right, and the pandemic. Okay, yeah. So there, I mean, just to take one tiny aspect of this whole terrible, terrible event, the wearing of the face masks, right? That in and of itself has been, for some cultures, mine included, a huge cultural shift towards this this protection of others, right? This limitation of oneself to protect those around you. And that is an act of commoning or recognizing that we are in an aerosolized commons of breathing, and that to breathe without fear, without a contagion, we need to cover our faces. And right there is an act of commoning that has been painful in the United States. It has been contested, it has been denied, it has been questioned, it is being overturned, it's being canceled, it's, you know, it's a mess. But for those who agree to it, it's an act of commoning. And if we can get more of those acts in practice, social distancing, you know, standing apart from people, taking care of others as we move about in the world, those are acts of mobile commoning. And those who resist it, it is part of a libertarian streak within American culture, right? This kind of individualism and right to do what you want, self-determination that is anti-commons. And so there's a cultural and political question there of how do you transition a society that has such a strong libertarian individualistic history to its political and culture and its social values. And that's where the sort of aspects of narrative and storytelling are really important. And many non-majoritarian groups in the United States, so Native American and indigenous peoples, as well as some African American and Latinx peoples, have cultural narratives and storying which are much more commoning, right? Which have a commons in them, which have a kind of collective, a social care and a care for the world. And so if we can capture those stories and sort of center and lift up those stories, maybe we have the cultural and social and political capacity to sort of change how we do things.
Go through other questions. we still have 20 minutes, so I like to exploit all the time we have. A question that is, I think, linked to the last two ones, from Ruben Axe. I hope to have pronounced it in the right way. My question, you said we need to overcome the existing systems of unjust and sustainable mobilities. Who is this we? Do you have specific actors in mind by priority, perhaps?
That's a tricky question. Who's the we? So the we, okay, the we emerges, I guess, in particular political struggles or public formations. And so when I'm talking about the we, I guess I'm assuming a certain audience who's listening to me, I don't know, but I'm thinking of, you know, the kinds of people who are debating these issues, considering these issues, talking about these issues, having public exchange around these issues. Obviously, that's not a we that includes everybody, but it's a we of a particular moment. And, you know, I've done a lot of work in the past on the formation of publics and the public sphere, which is what I originally did my PhD dissertation work on, actually, and on processes of democratization. And I studied what are sometimes called subaltern publics or counter publics. And I think that's another important aspect to think about in this moment of what kinds of publics are we able to form and how are they connected together. I also write about I've written about mobile publics, right? And so the idea of mobile publics and subaltern counter publics that can build bridges and alliances and networks across the world, really, to form a kind of more powerful we of some kind. And again, I think of like indigenous movements and struggles at the moment, which are extremely globally networked and are building power and visions for the future. And that's one important one to think about. And also African and Black diasporic movements across Africa, the Caribbean, Latin America, North America. Those are also networking and building connections together. So I guess it's those kinds of movements, as well as, you know, the climate activists and the climate change movement, the young people in the Sunrise movement here in the US, or the various movements in Europe, the followers of Greta Thunberg and many other young people. I think they form a kind of a collective that is articulating themselves as an actor that is another kind of we. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. Other two questions linked one to the other. At least I think so. I'm sorry, just my interpretation. I'm sorry. I apologize with the audience. From Mimi Shen, thank you very much for the inspiring presentation. My question is that individual mobilities may change when one enters a different life stage. Could you share some of your thoughts in relation to the context of aging or aged society? We see in the news that older people, especially those institutionalized, as well as their families, have faced a great challenge of compulsion during the pandemic. And this is also linked to another question of another part of the audience, and they were asking about how to determine the relation between freedom versus compulsion to move. So somehow maybe this is linked also to the previous one.
Yeah, wow, thanks for that question or questions. And I think that, I mean, the question of life stage and the elderly is very important, because in the work on mobility justice that I've done, I've talked about a little bit about differences in age and life stage, from children's mobilities to like families and parents being mobile with children, to elderly people's mobilities, as well as people living with disabilities. And often as we age, we might be living with more possible kinds of limitations on our mobilities, depending on the individual. And again, that I think ties into this idea of commoning mobilities and shared mobilities, because too often, especially in certain forms of like transport planning, there traditionally was an assumption of an individual, right? The commute to work, right? And we measure statistically by individuals, like how far did this individual move, and what was your mode? And work by feminist geographers and transport planners and mobility scholars has looked at the ways in which people move together and move with either with children, or in particular helping elderly parents or family members, and how especially women's mobilities have been much more linked to these patterns of sharing or caring mobilities, right? Mobilities in the act of caring for others, which are often not measured or not counted statistically when we look at the sort of journey to work traditional statistics, and how transport planning has been built around that. So that's one way I think to think about how mobility's approach would also consider the constellation of mobility to be this kind of shared interpersonal forms of movement, and the trips that we also take in acts of caring, or you could call it reproductive labor. And when that comes to this, I think to link it to the question on freedom versus compulsion to move, I mean, that's a big, obviously complicated question. And I don't think, I know the original question said, how would you determine the freedom versus the compulsion to move? And I don't think I would determine it. I mean, I'm not sure what you mean by determination exactly, but I think the point is that if we take that example I'm giving of these shared mobilities of caring, they're neither solely a free individual choice because you have to take care of your children, you have to take care of your elderly parents, and they're neither purely a compulsion. It's not that you have to do it because you want to do it. And so it's like, it's something else. It's this in-between thing that is a collective thing, interpersonal combination of compulsions and freedoms and ways that we live. So it's almost to say we need to get away from just the dichotomy of freedom versus compulsion and think in more complex ways about why we move, with whom, for what purposes. And that if we think about that more sort of fully and holistically, less reductively, that would be helpful for urban planning, transport planning, thinking about urban space and commons and who's using that space and why are they using it and what are they using it for. That would be, I think, more productive. And I think for the pandemic has been just so horrible for elderly people. I mean, those are the people who experience the greatest fatality rates, the illness rates, hospitalization rates, and isolation, social isolation. And to me, that also brings to light, in a way, all of the reproductive caring labor that keeps our societies together and alive, and that we need to also support. So as well as like this, and again, this goes back to Silvia Federici's work, is like, it's not just about supporting the economy and like the people going to jobs, the workers, but also the family and the ties and connections of care and love that keep families together, which also involve many mobilities.
Thank you, Mimi. Maybe we can ask the last two questions, and that are the following. One's more linked to the future scenarios, let's say. So the first one, yeah. Enrica Mangione asks, thanks for the very interesting presentation. I've got a question. During the last year in Italy, we saw tourist cities, but also university cities, losing most part of their mobile population, tourists, students, businessmen, and so on. This produced not just the empty of the short-term housing market, but made clear how these monoculture economies based on mobile populations make cities just more fragile and exposed to external stress. Do you think this can be something that the cities can learn from, or do you think we will go back to the situation in after pandemic future? The other question is, in the pathways of the new kind of relationship shaped by fear of COVID, do you see the opportunity for a new economic avenue that may rewrite capitalism? In particular, I registered an extraordinary rising of e-bike production from November 2020 till now. What do you think about the role of technologies in sustainable transition in post-pandemic scenario?
Okay.
From Roberto Battistini, sorry.
Right. And that one, and sorry, you said the rise of something, and I didn't quite catch that word. The rise of...
Yeah, sorry. The rise of e-bike production.
Oh, e-bike. Okay. Yeah. Great. So yeah, really good economic questions, I would say, if we'll link there. And wow, so okay. Tourism and university cities. That's interesting that you put those together, because I certainly have been involved in thinking critically about what I would call over tourism, to use a word in the literature, and extractive tourism, right? Forms of, and I worked on this especially in the Caribbean island region, these forms of tourism and tourism dependency of the economy, which are damaging to the environment and to people and to culture as well. And I know many places around the world face that, and yet are so economically dependent on tourism, it's very difficult to imagine, well, what would we do without it? What would come next? and certainly there's and I had not thought about it as closely in terms of university cities. So that's interesting because, you know, that's educational mobility, and we sometimes think of that in ways different from tourist mobility. But certainly universities are very connected with forms of kind of taking space and overwhelming local places, let's say, with the student population. And I've written an essay on reconstructing tourism in the Caribbean after the pandemic. And there I do argue for like the need for more sustainable and regenerative economies, economies that are built around relocalization in some ways of especially food production and food, what sometimes is called food sovereignty movements. And I do think there are cases, and I would think this would be the case in Italy as well. I don't with the slow food movement, right, and the local food movement, that some of these cities that are depopulated of tourists or students are maybe possibly like rediscovering a kind of localism of food culture and businesses built around that kind of regenerative circular economy. A big question I still have in my head around that is like, how do we scale that, right? Like you can think of it working on a small scale, but what does it mean for it to support an entire population who were supported previously by tourism? And that remains to be seen, I think. And I would still be interested in like seeing projects that are trying to do that and how they're doing that and how successful are they? How can you build that kind of economy from the sort of ground up? And that links to the second question because it does suggest a new economic avenue, right? It does suggest how do we think about different kinds of collectives of sustenance. Let's call it not just sustainability, sustenance and reproduction that I was mentioning, in which people live their lives in non-capitalist economic structures. And that's part of the idea of commoning, is that it's neither private nor public, right? It's something altogether different. So it's not state-supported, you know, public welfare systems, and it's not private economic ownership, but it's something in between that is collective. Now, some people see that as very, I don't know, romantic or something like that, and impractical. But we do have many things which do work that way in the world. And some people are trying to systematize that thinking through the idea of sharing economies or sharing cities. So Julian Agiman, for example, has worked on sharing cities. And I think that's an interesting direction to take it in, which incorporates like new technologies and e-bikes and, you know, localized production and many different ideas about that. Some of in the book Sharing Cities lays out some of the complexities of that, like the difference between it being captured by like sharing businesses, like companies, platform-based companies. So e-bikes are a great development, I think, and are definitely a much more sustainable form of mobility. They also are being promoted by companies that are going to sort of use them in capitalist ways. And so there's still, I think, a tension there between a shared city approach versus a sort of platform economy approach.
Thank you, Mimi. I think we discussed about a very huge amount of topics, and thank you for sharing your thoughts with us. And I really thank you again. And I leave the last talk to Matteo. If you want to add anything.
Yes. Thank you, Simone. It has been really a pleasure for me, for the Urban Studies Doctorate, and for the Center for Research on Mobility, Tourism and Environment of our university, to have had the opportunity to host the lecture of Professor Mimi Scheller. Her lecture gave us precious and deep insight into several issues of mobility justice and many other cutting-edge topics related to mobility and immobility, notably in this pandemic phase. I would like to thank the numerous participants, colleagues, and friends who have followed this lecture. Many of them are from abroad. And thanks particularly to Simone for the work he has done to make this meeting with Professor Scheller and this meeting possible. Thank you again, Mimi Scheller, and see you the next Urbeur appointment. Thank you again.
Thank you. Thanks so much. It's been a pleasure to be with you today.
Thank you. Thank you again. See you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.